Clayton, would you like to reach into the grab bag and grab out the first question for us?
It was Shane Johnson, who, by the way, went on Rich Eisen over the weekend or late last week and gave a shout out to the Wolverine.com. Rich Eisen, by the way, seems like a subscriber over at the Wolverine.com. So join him in being over there, and a lot of fun. He said he was following all the coverage over at the Wolverine. So appreciate that, Rich. Hopefully he's listening. Maybe not. But Shane Johnson
coming out of the woodwork this week for that.
Yeah, Dave Portnoy as well, tweeting a screenshot from the message board. So he's plugged in right now. His Twitter has been hilarious over the last week or so. But Shane Johnson says, is this a record going into the 9th game of the year? The only injury in the 2 deep is a wrist sprain with Mullings. Will he be back this week? Seems like it's trending that way, and that's what we had heard even before the bye week, before the Indiana game, or before the Michigan State game coming out of Indiana, that he was likely to return after the bye. So again, that'll be big. We kind of touched on that earlier on in the show, but it is a record in terms of what I can remember with injuries. I mean, this is a really healthy team. And it was a point that Michigan made, and some of the coaches kind of alluded to it, and even some of the veteran players in fall camp, that it was a goal to be as healthy as possible at the end of the year. And I think they saw the schedule and they understood that that was a realistic expectation for this team. It was something they could attain. It's something they've attained heading into November. So it's pretty incredible. I mean, really, you've had minor stuff. You knock on wood, but Mason Graham playing with, and then he comes back with a club and he plays almost better than he was before. So, there have been really minor stuff. Will Johnson, Rod Moore, you ease them into the year coming off of off-season injuries. But other than that, this has been an extremely healthy team, unlike a year ago at this time. And I think that's going to help them in this stretch run.
And that's what also makes some of the outrage from not just the message board, but social media. Oh gosh, why is it taking so long for Rod Moore? And oh, he looks terrible, in limited snaps. And Will Johnson, why won't he get out there? This was the plan. This was how it works. How they were hoping it would work. Even last year, it seemed like they had, maybe I'm blanking on something, but you lose Cade McNamara, you lost Eric All early, but last year they were able to stay fairly healthy, and obviously at the end, not the wheels fell off, but you lose Blake Corum.
Mike Morris, Scooney was hurt.
Mike Morris was, yeah. So they at this point last year, I think they were in relatively good shape, but they feel, it feels like they're on the up and up. I think they're, it's no coincidence that as we've seen guys like Rod Moore and Will Johnson get healthier, this team and this defense has played even better over the last several weeks. So yeah, it's a good spot to be in. And that's the benefit of, your starters essentially playing the equivalent of 6 games right now, as opposed to, the extra. They have basically the way the snaps have broken down. All of the Michigan starters have, basically have 2 less games of wear and tear on their bodies right now, plus the bye week. So you have to like where this team is at, coming off the bye. And like I said earlier, there could be some rust to knock off, but I don't think that's something that could bite them this week at all by any stretch. So it's a good spot to be in. Shane, thanks for the question.
Mm-hmm. We could hit one on defense from OJ.
Let's do it.
Will any of the remaining teams on Michigan's schedule score 20 or more points against them? I would say yes, because it would be absurd to go through a year and not have that happen. But so far, nobody scored more than 10. Just one team, Minnesota, scored 10. I mean, it's just insane that we're saying that at this point this year. So I will say yes. He also asked if Michigan scores 24 points against Penn State and Ohio State. Does Michigan win? I'd say they would drop one of those games. But it's not a guarantee the way this defense is playing.
Let me take question 1 first. I think you want me to call my shot. I'll say Maryland and Ohio State will do it back-to-back weeks.
Maryland. They could.
I'm going to say,
they could.
You know that old Josh Gaddis is going to have something drawn up for.
Is he?
For his old. I mean, it will probably be like a shotgun run on 4th and 1 or something, but
that could work.
I mean, I don't know. It's just so hard to maintain that pace. I think
it is.
I mean, Penn State God, that's tough. I'll stick with Maryland and Ohio State. As far as question 2, can you go through that one again?
if Michigan only scores 24 against Penn State and Ohio State, does Michigan win? While you think of it too, I'll add on to my answer there that they'll drop one of those. I think the defense will still play well in those games, but when you only score 24 or less, that plays into the other offense's hands too. I mean, that hurts your defense a little bit, puts them in tougher spots. So I will say the way that game would play out, if they only scored 24, they'd drop one of the two. And part of that would certainly be on the offense for sure.
Penn State, yes. I think 24 will get you a win in that game.
Yeah, I agree.
Ohio State, probably not. Even when your defense, Michigan's defense has played really well the last 2 years against Ohio State, and they still have given up 27 points and 23 points. So
they hung 50
I'm going to say
2 games. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if it's 24 points, and I would say, yeah, you'd probably split those games, but I think you'd feel pretty good about it at Penn State if you're able to do it. Because that Penn State offense just does. I mean, Drew Aller has an incredible arm. I think, we saw a big play late in that game Saturday was he kind of uncorks one down the sideline, but they just don't have the offensive firepower that an Ohio State has. So, I still feel pretty good about Michigan going into that game. So, yeah. What's next, Clay?
A2 Jim says, why would a strong institution like Michigan, even called arrogant by some, allow rivals and destructive forces, internal and external, to so influence their behavior? And who has the desire, cachet, and power inside Michigan to lead in situations like this? One strong individual can negate and unite plenty of disparate factions or disparate factions. I agree with him. I agree. And specifically when it comes to the Jim Harbaugh contract extension, why let optics, which are already out the window at this point, blowback, backlash, rivals that are trying to leak different things. Why let that influence what you're going to do with the future of your head coach? If something damning came out about Jim Harbaugh, you could get rid of him anyway, but facts are facts. He deserves more than what he's being paid at this point, much more. Michigan clearly agrees based on the nature of the contract extension that is being worked on right now. So I say get it done as soon as possible before you get to the NFL hiring cycle, and it would make no sense not to.
A lot to absorb from the question. I'll say this. I mean, something we've talked about before in terms of what the potential punishment for this is that really, and I think Chris wrote about this, I think that Dan Wetzel also said something to this effect, that really the biggest punishment that Michigan might have from this is kind of, the cracking of the facade of, the reputation in terms of being super squeaky clean, whatever. We can debate that. But ultimately, I think that it's, you're talking about maybe more of a Jim Harbaugh suspension. You're talking about, again, I doubt that Connor Stalions probably works in college football again. We'll see. But I think there's something to be said. We talked about this on the show I did yesterday too, is there's something to be said about letting the storm pass, so to speak, be the buffalo in the storm, and then also kind of being very smart, being very deliberate, and being contemplative about what your next step is too. Certainly there was some concern that, with this investigation going on, that Michigan would, the administration would make some kind of rash decision to, suspend Jim Harbaugh or to kind of self-impose a punishment before really we even know the breadth of what the facts of this thing are. So to me, I think that in terms of a response, people want to see them fight fire with fire, and that could be coming. I'm not saying it's not coming, but I do think the fact that it hasn't happened as quickly, it hasn't happened in real time as everyone's heads are spinning to calm everyone down. I do think that there is a deliberate reason for that. So in terms of who that uniting factor is, I mean, I don't think it's one person. I really do think it's time to get all boats sailing in the right direction. And, then you craft this single response, institutionally, and what you decide to do with your head coach moving forward. But, if this is something to where Jim Harbaugh is not necessarily linked to it, and people can jump to conclusions that, well, he should have known, and that there's no way he wouldn't have known. That's a discussion that you can let people have on social media. But the fact of the matter is that unless there's something that damns him, that there's no reason to not agree to a contract extension. And really, it should have been done in the winter anyways. So
right.
That's kind of my long-winded response to that.
Now you got to add more on it because time has passed now that who knows? Sasquatch 616 says what sly dig on the NCAA will be in Jim's speech from the podium after receiving the national championship trophy. There's going to be one, right? I remember the commercial that came out after Tom Brady won the Super Bowl, after the Deflategate thing, and he had the little line in there, Roger that. I thought that was very good. I think Jim Harbaugh is just as petty, if not more petty than Tom Brady. Maybe not more petty than Tom Brady,
somehow
but they're
pettier.
both petty. Yeah. So there will be something. There will be something, and it will be awesome to see if that happens. Obviously, still a long ways to go before something like that could come true. But there could be a dig along the way anyway, regardless of whether or not they win it all.
And contrary to popular belief, like, we're not his script writers either. Like, only he could come up with steel in your spine or field corn or, the gravitational pull. Like, we're not capable of that. But yeah, there's going to be a dig. And that's the other thing too, is that, like, isn't the only, like, the best revenge, the best response to any of this is to keep kind of destroying everybody and win it all. And then you deal with the repercussions of whatever happens after that. But the biggest response to any of this that Michigan as an institution, as a football program, can have right now is to keep winning. This last month of the season, if you want to say that, like, it's Connor Stallions isn't around, Michigan is stripped of apparently the greatest sign-stealing mind in the history of college football, whatever you want to call it. But it's game on now. It's football. It's all out there. As long as they play the games, win the games. I think that's the best institutional response you could have to it.
Mm-hmm. Wolverine Farm 22, is Michigan going to beat OSU by 20 or 40? And to follow up, will Harbaugh call Day out for being a whiny B word? Won't use the full term there after the game. I don't think he'll call him out. That handshake is going to be interesting, but Jim Harbaugh has seemed to have grown ever since the Jim Schwartz handshake days at Ford Field back then. I would say it'd be closer to 20 than 40, though. I would predict a Michigan win at this point in the year. I think it might be closer, and even though going into this game, and again, we're almost a month still almost a month away, just under, it looks like the gap between Michigan and Ohio State is as big as it's been in Michigan's favor in quite a while when you look at it before, but it could still mean a closer game. I mean, games play out differently. The score may not indicate how close the game was, that sort of thing. So I think the, it would be wild if they won that big 3 years in a row. I think it'll be semi-close, but I'll go with Michigan, and I'll go with a no call-out, maybe a dig at the post-game press conference, similar to 2021 with the third base comment. That has stuck quite a bit and frustrated tough guy Ryan Day.
The one thing I will say about this Ohio State team is that they have gotten in a few fist fights this year. And I think generally speaking, like, when you pull them into when Michigan's pulled them into that type of game the last few years, Michigan's kind of pummeled them over the course of 4 quarters. But what we have seen is that, they do at least, like, Ohio State's gotten themselves into some of these low scoring, kind of physical Big Ten style of games. And, they've got that steel in their spine, so to speak. So I do think if it's, a knockdown, drag out kind of game, I think this Ohio State team is maybe better equipped to hang for 4 quarters than the last 2 have been. But they're not as good at quarterback. And, I think that's the key to all this, is that when Michigan plays that game the last Saturday in November, it's going to have the best quarterback on the field. And that's not something that's happened in this rivalry. I mean, 2011, maybe, but yeah, it's I still
definitely
advantage
11.
Michigan.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do. It has nothing to do with what's happened, over the course of this season. I mean, it does actually have a lot to do with what's happened over the course of this season. But I guess what I would say is I haven't seen anything to pull me off the preseason prediction that I made I think you made it as well that this team would go
Yep.
undefeated in the regular season. So
I like these two from DJ Wolverine. Which non-starters do you see having an increased role in November from what we've seen the first 2 months? I will say I'm intrigued by a couple of the guys we saw early in the game against Michigan State at corner. Amorion Walker being one of them, could have had an interception. Pretty impressive, his length and kind of his speed catching up there. He reacted a little bit slow, but he was able to close quickly. And then DJ Waller almost had a pick in that game as well, pass breakup. I don't think Waller is going to be a guy that's going to get that type of time, but I think Amorion Walker could be if he continues to progress, or at least we'll see him in somewhat of a rotation. I'm probably not thinking of somebody else, but then that ties into his second questions that we can get to too. But who am I missing there?
Walker would have been mine. The other, I'm split on offense between Kalel Mullings, which I guess wouldn't be a breakout player at this point because we've seen it the last few weeks, but I think that he's going to keep factoring into this.
That's a great pick. That's a great pick.
Samaj Morgan too. I think there's some things that they can do with him that we haven't really seen them, explore yet. Like, I think he might be able to kind of step in and backfill the idea of what they had for AJ Henning that we never quite saw materialize on the field, but I do think that there are some parallels there. So I'll say Walker, but then I'll go with those two guys on offense too.
I like all those. And then his second question, which starting player on both offense and defense needs to step up to increase your confidence that Michigan will three-peat as East Division champions? I love this one. It's kind of similar because, some of the guys we're pointing to could be, in the last question, could be guys that are, pushing some of these guys that we're about to talk about. I'd say Josh Wallace on the defensive side. He's done a good job. He's kind of what we thought he was going to be in terms of a physical corner. He's pretty long. He can come up and play the run. He can come up and play a lot of those quick passes. Teams have tried to test him in that area, and he's passed. But he's also gotten lucky a couple times, getting burnt on double moves twice. Once against Bowling Green, guy catches the ball in the end, or guy drops the pass in the end zone, and then against Indiana when quarterback was Michigan got to the quarterback before he could get exposed, of getting burnt on the double team against Indiana. So I just think that Ohio State, maybe even Penn State, they're going to try to pick on him as well. I don't know that it's going to work, but I think he's a guy that I think needs to play a little bit better in coverage down the field. And then you could name countless amount of guys that you think need to take a jump, maybe even from good to elite, or make some elite plays here and there situationally when you need them in November, because this is the time of year when you might need a Mike Sainer still pass breakup in the end zone like we saw in Cade Stover last year. Like you're going to need those types of big time plays from guys, even if you don't expect it from that guy. So we could list a bunch of guys there, but I'll say Josh Wallace on defense, maybe like a Tyler Morris on offense. The kind of a third receiver when things are tougher against these better teams. If other guys aren't getting as much separation, you just need another reliable option. He's been good. Also didn't have a great game against Michigan State, I thought. So I'll go with him on offense, but things have been clicking pretty well there.
I've got two. They're both on offense. One, first and foremost, is Ladarius Henderson. You've got Chop Robinson coming up on the schedule. You've got JT Tuimoloau. I believe that's how you pronounce him, from Ohio State. JTT. We'll just go with that.
Yeah.
Have some good pass rushers coming up on the schedule. And Henderson, I think, has the tackle situation since they made the lineup switch, I think, has been better. It's been steadier, but still waiting to see a little bit more from Henderson. A little up and down at times, but he's one, and I think this one's obvious. It's Donovan Edwards, right? Like getting Donovan Edwards back on track.
I should have said him too. Yeah.
To being, if Blake Corum's the hammer, someone's got to be that lightning as a change of pace back, as a guy that can catch the football. I think we've seen them, we've seen that's the other thing about them playing these, lopsided games, is that it kind of cuts down on everyone's workload. So any attempt, we saw them, work Donovan Edwards extra in that Indiana game just to get him a touchdown. But, the fact that they haven't been in these 4-quarter fights has kind of prevented them a little bit from calling enough plays to get that guy in a rhythm. But I've said it all season long, and I'm not doing it to curse him or anything like that. I just feel like the longer that we've gone without a Donovan Edwards breakout game, the more violent the return to the mean is going to be. And I don't know when that is, but you've got some pretty big games coming up, which leads me to believe that if it's coming, he's going to be a huge difference in them. So that would be my pick on for that particular question.
On that note, Ohio Wolverine says, do you think Donovan Edwards' lack of production is the fact that starters only played 2.5 quarters this year? I seem to remember a lot of his production, especially against Ohio State, coming in the second half. Would be interesting to see a comparison of his first and second half stats in 2022. He ran well, I thought, in the first half of the Big Ten Championship. He ran well in the first half of some other games. Penn State was a second half type of game.
Did he bust off a 50-yard run, like the first play from
first play against
TCU?
Against TCU, and then he didn't do a ton really after that. If you look at the rest of his carries, I mean, I'll say overall, I think it's going to be interesting to see when Michigan gets in those 4-quarter games, like how much of the lack of run game production and really the numbers of it is going to come to fruition in those games, because they haven't been able to wear teams down and keep leaning on them and leaning on them with the starters. Maybe that has impacted things. Maybe that's where the big runs are going to come. So I think there's something to that. I don't think there's necessarily something to that individually with Donovan, but maybe it's all running backs. It's going to happen with Blake too, even Kalel potentially. So I think there's something to that theory, though, with what Ohio Wolverine saying. Maybe that's why some of the numbers don't look as good as they have in the past, just because of how lopsided these games have been and the backups coming in early on.
Some food for thought here. Again, I don't think this will be his workload on Saturday, but last year against Purdue in the Big Ten title game, 25 carries, 185 yards, and a touchdown with a long of 60 yards, which I think was one of the first. Was it maybe the first snap from scrimmage in the second half, or one of the first few? I forget what it was.
I think so. Yeah.
So maybe this is the weekend under the lights. We'll see what winds up happening.